Is it true that only around 200 of the 80,000 chemicals in the United States have actually been tested for safety?
There's, in terms of numbers, perhaps one could dispute, some of those numbers, but the problem is when we look at active ingredients in pesticides, there are only certain numbers there that have been tested. And the sort of the bottom of the iceberg, though, that for me is particularly scary, is we have the active ingredients that are sometimes tested and sometimes well, sometimes not in terms of toxicity to humans and the environment. But when you go out and you go to the hardware store, which many people do, you pick up a pesticide, you don't have to have a permit, you don't have to have a license in education or anything else. Pick that up and look, and the active ingredient will typically be between maybe 1 and 5%. Then you have the inactive ingredients. Those are the adjuvants, and those are the solutions in many cases that carry the active ingredient. Those are untested. They're also trade secrets. Also, if you're poisoned and you call the poison center, they may or may not be able or willing to tell you what those other ingredients are other than the active ingredient. And so by any measure, we're not even scratching the surface in terms of looking at what's going on out there.
How many chemicals or pesticides existed, say, 100 years ago?
So it depends on how you define pesticides. And 100 years ago, the typical pesticides that were used were, at least in the European and American context, primarily copper, sulfur, arsenic sometimes, interestingly enough. And so there were some pesticides that were being used at that point. But, I have to say there are also pesticides, for example, if we go back in Indian culture, there were naturally occurring substances that were used as pesticides, which had a toxicity but would break down very quickly. So part of it depends, and sometimes the industry uses this against us. It's what you call a pesticide and what it really means. And for me, the difference is very much in many ways the difference between synthetic pesticides and then the naturally occurring pesticides. We don't want to use even much of those, but there is a big difference.
What influence does the chemical and pesticide industry have over our politicians?
I think it's called the pockets. Who is in whose pockets, in this case, and certainly the politicians, as we're, looking at what's going on in terms of legislation. Politicians don't want to take on the pesticide industry, and I'll give them a little bit of credit. There is some truth to the fact that the science is really challenging. It's hard to understand what the detrimental impacts of pesticides are. And, do you have the time to dig in and figure that out? It's tough. But I think that's when you start to depend on folks like people who are here at the Real Truth About Health conference, people who have distilled this information. They've dedicated their lives to trying to figure out what it means to have certain pesticides, there. So, the challenge for us in so many ways with regard to politicians is the science is hard enough to do and do well. Certainly when we've got this massive cocktails, that are swirling about us in terms of all the environmental toxins that are out there that we've put out there. So science is challenging, and then you've got to translate the findings of science into policy. And that's not easy, so I'll give that to the politicians.
Is it true that most of the 206 nations of the world don't regulate agricultural poisons?
So certainly many of the governments really struggle with how to regulate those. And when you look at how many agricultural pesticides there are out there, as well as cosmetic pesticides that are used on lawns and golf courses, playgrounds, those places, it's a real challenge, I think, for governments to keep up. It takes a lot of funding. There's no question about that. And very often, some governments around the world are fairly reliant on the agrochemical companies giving them advice as to what they need in order to modernize and feed the world, which is a phrase that rubs me the wrong way. Not that we shouldn't do it, but we think in many ways we are doing it, but at the same time, we're not getting that food where it needs to go in many cases.
What influence does the chemical and pesticide industry have over the Environmental Protection Agency and other governmental agencies?
Right. So first, I want to put a shout out, I guess, to our friends in the EPA who are trying to do the good work, and they're doing the good battle that they're doing from the inside, which is I think they're public servants. It's thankless in many cases, and yet it's the people who very often are the political appointees and those who start sort of steering the ship from the top. They're the ones who really, I think, bear the burden of responsibility for these different policies slipping through. And so the EPA unquestionably is challenged, I think, in the oversight of these pesticides. And part of it is the science is complicated, and we do have so many of these different chemicals that are out there that need to be tested. And as I mentioned, we've also got all of these non-active ingredients that are there. Sometimes I'm sure there are people that sit there and scratch their heads and wonder, where do we even begin? And this is before you start to get the combinative effects of these different pesticides interacting with one another. That's a whole different beast.
Is there glyphosate in my food and water? And should I care about this?
Chances are pretty darn good, unless you're living a life that I'm not sure you're able to live many places here in the U.S. As soon as you go out and consume most of the grains that are produced not organically here, processed foods, almost no matter what you do, you're going to be exposed to glyphosate. If you go into public parks, playgrounds, school grounds, unfortunately, in too many cases, there's the exposure there. Our pets are exposed. Why are cancers on the rise for domesticated pets, over the past couple of decades? Certainly it's the way we're starting to treat our lawns, literally and figuratively. So, sorry, but chances are pretty good.
What concerns do you have about our soil in terms of our ability to grow enough healthy food to feed society?
So when you look at soil and soil science, what I find so fascinating is that it really began, in trying to look at soil, understand soil by virtue of the geological processes, that created it. And so, I'd say as a culture, we got really good at understanding, the genesis of these soils and how they were created and what makes sand, silt, and clay and different kinds, and the acidity, versus the alkalinity. So we started there. By virtue of doing that, we needed to take a step further and then start to look at the chemicals that were there. And so Justus from Liebig was a scientist back in the late 1800s. He started looking at NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, looking at how that impacted plants by virtue of what was in the soil. And that was good science. It was important to do that. Started to think about the micronutrients and the macronutrients both. But then, I think we forgot the biology. We forgot that there are all of these organisms, and different figures are out there, but a teaspoon of soil may have more than 1 million microorganisms within it. It's a living web. It's this interface, between the geological processes and the chemicals and the organisms themselves. And we really just have started to understand that. Fortunately, it's now being recognized even by the USDA. They put out this wonderful book about 15, 20 years ago, the Soil Biology Primer. And primer is sort of where we were, just starting to begin. So it's the same thing as throwing the chemicals, into the air, onto the trees, into these habitats for birds and insects. Soil is habitat. It's important.
Is it true that organic farming yields are higher than conventional yields in drought years and the same in normal years?
So the best studies that we have in what we would call long-term ecological research, really the best long-term study that we have in the United States for understanding organic agriculture versus, there is a contrast, so it is sort of, versus, that would be at the Rodale Institute, and they have their long-term ecological study looking at side-by-side organic and conventional farming systems. And the results of that study, the FST, the Farming Systems Trial, I think it's into about 35 years now. It's a long track record of doing these things, in parallel fashion. And certainly in drought years, organic wins, and that's because of organic matter, the ability to hold not just the water, but water is a vector for nutrients, hold the nutrients as well. And also in wet years, there are some advantages. And then certainly in the moderate yields, things can things can equal out, but we've got to give the soil time to recuperate after it's been managed conventionally. Still all these residual chemicals, compaction. You've got to let that basically regenerate in order to get to this high performance level of organic. So it's not just any soil at any point in time. It's got to be managed, cultivated, taken care of.